And then I need to share screen again. And last session's recording is still not on Moodle. I'll make sure it's on Moodle in the next 24 hours, along with this one. Okay, let's start with just a reflective exercise before we get to talk about intersectionality theoretically and empirically speaking. What I'd like you to do is look at this wheel and think about, basically think about yourself. Don't think about anything else. On this wheel, there are a number of what's called social identities. Gender, age, socioeconomic status. They're not only social identities, of course, but they're an element of these concepts relates to social identity. Age, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, ability, sexuality, politics or political views, and religion. You don't have to share this unless you feel comfortable. But think for like maybe 3 minutes, think what are the identities that have the strongest effect on how you perceive yourself? And then what do you think are the identities that have the strongest effect on how others perceive you? So just take a couple of minutes to think about yourself. Okay. So Fatima wrote in the chat that there's a difference between how she perceives herself and how others perceive her. The same thing with Zaina. And Sarah, you have your hand up, or is this from before?
Yes, Doctor, it's from now.
Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
The way I perceive myself is that I'm a woman. I'm still young, and I'm Muslim. I would just want to like reflect on something that we veiled women always face, especially in Lebanon. Veiled women are like legally are not allowed to apply for posts in work, such as being a judge or so, and indirectly they are like I don't know how to say it, impeded from actually getting a work opportunity just because she is veiled or wearing hijab. And it happened, I see it a lot and I hear it a lot. It happened with my friends, especially one of them was an architect. She applied for work. Her resume was very much excellent. And employer reflected back to her on WhatsApp that you have very much a good potential and resume, but I just have one question. Are you veiled? Because if so, we cannot employ veiled women. And he said it explicitly. And it was very much trending on Facebook and the screenshots, the WhatsApp, WhatsApp chat. And so the way she saw herself, for example, as an architect, she's a woman. She has a religious belief, but how politics and how the if I may say, social norm did not accept her as she believes herself.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And I see a couple of people agreeing with you, Zaina and Dana, that they have similar experiences as well. So, Okay, so here, this is an example of how, let's say, you perceive yourself in a certain way, but the others perceive you, they focus on your dress. This is what I understood from Sarah, that's okay. We will talk about social identity and structures of oppression as well, and the link between the two. And actually the first article, I think Cooper, that I referred to, brings in that critique about, you know, how intersectionality links social identity with structures of oppression. In this case, you know, this is a very local, again, context. This is a very local contextual example of how identity enacted and identity perceived influence people's chances and opportunities in Lebanon. This is observed in the Middle East and Gulf region in general, not just the dress, but what the dress reflects about one's beliefs and religion. Okay, so yes, I mean, it's not only the dress, but it's these ideas that are formed in relationship to basically the stereotypes and the ideas formed about what it means for a woman to be veiled, to be hijab or not. Okay, so thank you for sharing this, and it's good that you shared it, because clearly it's an issue that others have, you know, are also voicing as well. Any other reflections, whoever feels comfortable? Yeah, Reem?
Okay, so I would like to share with you something that happened with me. So I'm in the Lebanese Scout in the NGO since I was a kid, and then I was hired to be one of the highest chief in all over Lebanon. And when it comes to my village, to my group where I used to be, they decided to put me at the highest leader. And then everyone was looking at my ability and my skills and all these and the training I did locally and internationally. But the nun, the director of the school, she said, no, I don't want a girl. I don't want a chief as a girl. I want a boy. So this was very weird situation. And the president of the NGO said, okay, but you know, you are a director and you are a woman. So for sure, this woman can do this task. So here we can see how the society attribute leadership to man and try to take it away from women.
Okay, this is a very important example. So it was the nun who said no, she wants a male, and it was the other person was a man who said no, they want you as the in this leadership position.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, interesting how things go. Again, this is a relationship between gender and religion as well. Religious views of who, or views by religious people in religious places of authority. Okay. Okay, Isaac, in New York, in the United States, was told that the barber shop is not for Black people. Okay, in New York. Okay. Fatima. You had your hand up, Fatima? Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to say that although I know that I perceive myself differently from what others perceive me, but living in a sort of homogeneous environment, because all people around me shared similar background, socioeconomics, religion, politics, and they don't have problem with gender. But when I go out of my community, I see that they focus on the gender, the socioeconomics, religion and ethnicity. So I find myself discriminated because I'm Palestinian or because I wear the veil or something. But I didn't really suffer from it because, you know, even my job is within my community. It's a kind of homogeneous one.
Okay. So you're most of the time you spend in a homogeneous environment, but when you go out, you experience, you basically, then your identity as also as a woman and religion and ethnicity then is highlighted in how people perceive you, how outsiders perceive you.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Okay. Type. Thank you, everyone. And Isaac, I don't know what to tell you about this experience in New York, but I mean, it's what's happening in the United States is a terrible. Actually, one of the things that I've been doing the past 2 weeks is every evening I watch the George Floyd court proceedings, I think they're called. And this has actually affected my my work, because I usually do some work in the evening, but the last couple of weeks I've been spending 2 hours every evening watching TV. So it's very telling how you know, how that incident of George Floyd has exposed so much underneath the surface in the United States. A lot of people who want to immigrate to the US and who have not been there, who dream about the US, really get like an awakening after they move to the US and experience some of the, and now with Asian Americans, of course. And it's very bad, because also it's within ethnic groups in Asian, like the hatred and the discrimination against Asian Americans. Okay. Yes.
Oh, I just also wanted to mention that, okay, someone has mentioned that discrimination is still a big issue, but it is actually now becoming more serious, as it is now going into even people with the same race, even discriminating each other. Today I was shocked when I read some story about the girls in South Africa who bullied a black girl. They were brown, they are not like white, but they are just brown in color. And they bullied a girl, and that very day the girl committed suicide because she was discriminated. She was beaten that she is not beautiful because she's black. So I just agree with someone who has said that discrimination is still a big issue. So don't know how this one is going to end, but it is seriously like disturbing.
Right. I mean, definitely, it's a global, it's a pandemic globally. It's not, I mean, it manifests differently in different contexts. So the way it manifests in the US is different than it would manifest in South Africa, for example, or in the Arab region or in Asia. Nonetheless, there are processes that are universal about basically othering, you know, the stereotyping and othering certain groups and discriminating against them. I've done some work in the past on discrimination and self-perceived discrimination, and on the processes of creating basically an other group and discriminating against them. Currently, I'm actually working with an undergraduate student. Fatima knows about this, with an undergraduate student, where we're looking into data sets, if there are data sets in the Arab region that allow us to look at discrimination, experiencing discrimination, whether because of gender, because of ethnicity, because of color, because of region in the country, and of course in our country because of religion. I mean, not only in our region, but also in Europe and in the US, also discrimination because of religion and as well. Okay, so thank you everyone for your contributions. This is basically what intersectionality addresses or tries to address. At the core of intersectionality, there's gender, sex and gender. I'm gonna just quickly go over this slide, which basically shows this sort of like development, intellectual development, and our way of thinking about health and its impact on women and men. Originally, I mean, this is not originally, we still have people who study sex differences in health. For example, sex differences in cardiovascular disease, sex differences in mental health, where they merely, you know, look at numbers and percentages and present them in a study. Then we moved into a more sophisticated way of thinking about gender and health, where we have looked at gender as a social construct, as an identity and a social construct that determines identity and social roles and decides in any society, again, contextually, what is considered to be masculine behavior or masculine identity, what is considered to be a feminine behavior or feminine identity. So we have journals in public health that are called Women's Health, or the European Journal of Women's Health Journal, you know, what is it called? Reproductive, no, that doesn't have the woman in it. Then we have journals called Men's Health. So there's the American Journal of Men's Health. There are journals called Masculinities and Health. So this is a more sophisticated and deeper way of thinking about these differences in health outcomes between men and women. And then the more sophisticated way of thinking about how men and women experience different chances in life and different health outcomes is intersectionality. So we're going to spend the next hour or 50 minutes or so talking about intersectionality. I have some slides that are colorful. Here in this pictorial representation, I just wanted to present gender as a construct that is influenced by biology to some extent, but it's much, much broader than biology. And biology, or sex, is the aspects of the body, the phenotype and the genotype. Gender is broader than this and incorporates our social constructions and social understandings of what that body is supposed to look like and behave like, and what type of opportunities that, you know, female and male bodies, the different opportunities that female bodies and male bodies have in any society in the specific social context. So gender in Lebanon may differ, our conceptualizations of what is feminine in Lebanon may differ from what is considered to be feminine in South Africa or in Korea, for example. Okay, it's all related to the context. So let me show you the next couple of slides that I hope will get your simplify the way of thinking about intersectionality. We are not unidimensional. As individuals, we don't just have one identity. We are multi-dimensional in the way we experience our identities and the way others perceive our identities. A woman can be either a working class woman, or a woman who has a professional job, or a woman who is a stay-home wife or mother, or a woman who is wealthy, might also be stay-home, but can be a CEO of a company. So if we think about the first identity as being a woman, and I represent it here with the color green. So in any society, there are 50% of any society is women in general, unless there's infanticide, you know, then you have less women. But then not all women have the same shape, okay? Well, not all women have the same shape, even like in terms of their body, but not all women have the same class identity. They're all women, but they have very different class identities. You have, for example, if you have a gathering that has wealthy women or professional women, academic women, women who work in engineering or in companies, in corporations, then when you have also a woman, but who is a working class woman in that type of gathering, this working class woman will experience that gathering completely differently than the rest of the women. okay? She might, in fact, be discriminated against by other women because she is working class. She might have, maybe she works in agriculture. Her hands show that she works in agriculture. Her back shows, her skin shows that she's exposed to the sun, that she works as a farmer, as a peasant. So she will experience her social class, but also her gender differently in a setting where she is with other women who have a different social class. Similarly, if we have a social group made up of all working class people, even working class people who work in agriculture, or working class people who work in a factory, for example, in a car factory, or in a food production factory, or in the case of some countries in the region that have garment factories, okay? Even though they're all working class, and they, by virtue of them working in a factory, the woman who is a working class will have a totally different experience than men who are working class. If you actually follow unions in Lebanon, whether it's the union of taxi drivers or the union of, you know, working class unions, you will notice that these working class unions are very, very much made up of men, and the discourse, the language, the causes, and the work, the type of work is very much masculine in terms of moving forward with like union demands and union activities. So for example, a woman who is a taxi driver, and there are apparently a few of them in Lebanon, a woman who is a taxi driver, I don't know how she would fit into a meeting held by men who are in the taxi drivers union. I don't know if they're called taxi drivers. I think in Lebanon they're called, I don't know. Anyways, okay.
Service.
The service. No, I
Yes.
think it's something related to النقل والنقل.
النقل المشترك.
Public transport.
Public transport. Yeah. Okay. النقل العام يعني. No. Anyways.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So this is what intersectionality basically suggests. What is intersectionality? It's saying that people have multiple identities, and these multiple identities are influenced, and this is really important because this is part of the original conceptualization of intersectionality. We will watch the video again, or actually because of, how many, did anybody not watch the video that I sent by email? It's fine, you can raise your hand, don't worry about it. Because if a couple of you didn't watch the video, I will show it again. But if you've all watched it, you forgot about it. Zaina. And Dalia didn't. Okay, so let's watch it actually. But let me just say that intersectionality is really about how our identities are not linear, but that we have different or a multitude of identities that intersect. Intersect meaning it's like an intersection. That's what Kimberly Crenshaw showed, that overlap, absolutely. And this overlapping, this area where, let's say, race and disability overlap, people who experience disability and who are of particular group that is racialized in any society, they experience their disability differently than people who are not racialized, okay? Women experience their disability differently. We talked about this actually, not in this course, in the seminar. Women experience disability differently than men, I'm sorry. So here, gender and disability intersect, gender and race intersect. Sexual orientation and disability intersect, and sexual orientation and race intersect. The color, and this is a nice representation because the color is actually, if this is like light peach or pink color, and this is blue, the intersection is neither pink nor blue. It's a different color. It's qualitatively different. The experience of someone who has a non-normative sexual orientation and who is racialized is a qualitatively different experience than someone who is only racialized or someone who only has a sexual orientation where they're stereotyped because of that sexual orientation. Let's see if we can watch the video. And it's here. Why isn't it playing? Okay, I don't know why it's not playing. Let me go back to my slides. Let's do this.
Many years ago, I began to use the term intersectionality to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems like racism and sexism are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice. Now, the experience that gave rise to intersectionality was my chance encounter with a woman named Emma de Graffenried. Emma de Graffenried was an African-American woman, a working wife, and a mother. I actually read about Emma's story from the pages of a legal opinion written by a judge who had dismissed Emma's claim of race and gender discrimination against a local car manufacturing plant. Emma, like so many African-American women, sought better employment for her family and for others. She wanted to create a better life for her children and for her family. But she applied for a job and she was not hired. And she believed that she was not hired because she was a Black woman. Now, the judge in question dismissed Emma's suit. And the argument for dismissing the suit was that the employer did hire African Americans and the employer hired women. The real problem, though, that the judge was not willing to acknowledge was what Emma was actually trying to say, that the African Americans that were hired, usually for industrial jobs, maintenance jobs, were all men. And the women that were hired, usually for secretarial or front office work, were all white. Only if the court was able to see how these policies came together would he be able to see the double discrimination that Emma de Graffenried was facing. But the court refused to allow Emma to put two causes of action together to tell her story because he believed that by allowing her to do that, she would be able to have preferential treatment. She'd have an advantage by being able to have two swings at the bat when African-American men and white women only had one swing at the bat. But of course, neither African-American men or white women needed to combine a race and gender discrimination claim to tell the story of the discrimination they were experiencing. Why wasn't the real unfairness law's refusal to protect African-American women simply because their experiences weren't exactly the same as white women and African-American men? Rather than broadening the frame to include African-American women, the court simply tossed their case completely out of court. Now, as a student of anti-discrimination law, as a feminist, as an anti-racist, I was struck by this case. It felt to me like injustice squared. So first of all, Black women weren't allowed to work at the plant. Second of all, the court doubled down on this exclusion by making it legally inconsequential. And to boot, there was no name for this problem. And we all know that where there's no name for a problem, you can't see a problem. And when you can't see a problem, you pretty much can't solve it. Many years later, I'd come to recognize that the problem that Emma was facing was a framing problem. The frame that the court was using to see gender discrimination or to see race discrimination was partial, and it was distorting. For me, the challenge that I faced was trying to figure out whether there was an alternative narrative, a prism that would allow us to see Emma's dilemma, a prism that would allow us to rescue her from the cracks in the law, that would allow judges to see her story. So it occurred to me, maybe a simple analogy to an intersection might allow judges to better see Emma's dilemma. So if we think about this intersection, the roads to the intersection would be the way that the workforce was structured by race and by gender. And then the traffic in those roads would be the hiring policies and the other practices that ran through those roads. Now, because Emma was both Black and female, she was positioned precisely where those roads overlapped, experiencing the simultaneous impact of the company's gender and race traffic. The law was like that ambulance that shows up and is ready to treat Emma only if it can be shown that she was harmed on the race road or on the gender road, but not where those roads intersected. So what do you call being impacted by multiple forces and then abandoned to fend for yourself? Intersectionality seemed to do it for me. I would go on to learn that African American women, like other women of color, like other socially marginalized people all over the world, were facing all kinds of dilemmas and challenges as a consequence of intersectionality, intersections of race and gender, of heterosexism, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism. All of these social dynamics come together and create challenges that are sometimes quite unique.
Okay. Do you hear me like this? Because I usually put my earphones on, but now I'm...
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so I think that like 5-minute TED Talk, like 5 minutes taken out of the TED Talk, really like explains intersectionality beautifully and in very simple terms. Now, if you try to read any of Kimberly Crenshaw's, because she's a legal scholar, if you try to read any of her articles, it's much worse than in terms of complexity than the article that you read for today. Not the Hankivsky article, the Cooper article. Okay, so here, I want to ask you, do you think that gender, is it a social identity or a system of oppression? How do you perceive of your gender? Could be both. Sarah said social identity. Fatima said both. Okay. Okay. Okay, what about race? If you think of yourself as someone who has a race. Also depends on the context. Okay. Okay. It's more a system of oppression. Okay. Okay, again, I like the fact that you're thinking, both, it depends on where, it depends on the country, depends on the setting. Yes. I actually, I avoid as much as possible using the word race. I try to use the term racialization because I think race is perceived completely differently. It's socially constructed. The writings about race as a biological entity are outdated and are fraught with scientific problems. And I think of race as more of like a construct that is developed and given life in different contexts. And in many contexts, race can be, or racialization is a system of oppression. And gender or patriarchy, there are these terms that we also didn't go over in this course. Patriarchy can be a system, is a system of oppression as well. So what is the definition of intersectionality? Basically, it says that a person's social identity is shaped by the interactions of different social locations in which they inhabit. Okay, so social identity is very much influenced by social location, but social location is also a structural phenomenon. It's, as we've read in the life course, for example, or the fundamental cause theory, but particularly in the life course, people at birth inhabit a social location. People at age 1 can be, based on where they are brought up, where they are located, can be at risk of lead poisoning or not at risk of lead poisoning, of exposure to secondhand smoke or not exposure to secondhand smoke. So it is the person's identity, but it's also very much an outcome of or interacts with the location that this individual inhabits. It's determined by age, gender, race, ethnicity, the location that the person inhabits, determined by age, gender, race, ethnicity, social class, sexual orientation, nationality and immigrant status, which is very important in our context. Citizenship status, for example, very much determines or intersects with other identities and social locations, disability and ability, language that people use, and in some contexts, indigenous status in Australia and the United States and Palestine, in indigeneity or being a native to the land and being like ruled by the colonizer makes a big difference in shaping the person's identity and social location as well. So identity here, at least in the formulation of intersectionality, identity is very much something that develops or that is given life and is shaped by inequitable social, economic, and political structures. So in a sense, this is very similar to syndemics. In syndemics, we're talking about two diseases or two health outcomes, risk factor, health outcome, disease, that interact under specific social, economic, and political structures. Here again, an individual's identity or even group identity is developed and shaped under systems of patriarchy. So women come to understand their identity in systems of patriarchy. Patriarchy exists everywhere. It's more intense in some contexts than others, but there's patriarchy everywhere. So women come to understand their identity as women and how they should express their femininity as women under or in the context of a patriarchal system. The same thing, racism, homophobia, for example, people who have dark skin or black skin in the United States, in Lebanon, come to understand or shape their identity in a context where there is racism or prejudice and discrimination against dark skin. Homophobia, ableism, ageism, and colonialism, all of these isms. Okay. In intersectionality, this term called mutually constitutive or mutually constructive is very important. And what does this mean? What it means is that, again, this is, I try to represent, as you have noticed since the beginning of the semester, I try to represent ideas through very simple graphs, not graphs, but very simple pictorial representations. So if a person, if one individual experiences their gender identity and experiences their race identity in a specific context, the intersection of gender and race is something that is unique. It is not just gender, it is not just race, it's mutually constitutive, meaning it's a qualitatively different experience. Again, identity is experienced or is shaped under a system of gender oppression, and race is experienced under a system of racial oppression. So in this case, a woman who is racialized experiences the intersection of gender and race qualitatively differently than just the addition of gender and race. The color, I'm representing this here by showing a very different color. So if gender is yellow and race is orange, the mutually constitutive experience of being a woman who is racialized is qualitatively different. It's a blue color. It's neither yellow nor orange. It is blue. Okay. I'm sorry if this is like a very simple idea, but I've actually felt, you know, when I first was introduced to intersectionality, I felt that simplifying it then allows me to understand it, and then you know, over time I can read more and more sophisticated or complex writings about intersectionality. Does acquaintances wasta fall in the ability location or can be considered as a separate entity? So acquaintances or wasta, if you think about it as you know, we talked about social relations, but in our context, there's a specific type of social relations that you can formulate as wasta, meaning it's not only social relations where you have an emotional connection with someone who that you can talk with or receive instrumental support from. It's in a context where there is corruption, the social relations then become a way of getting resources in a country where equal opportunity is not provided. Meaning, if you graduate, just to give an example, if you graduate from a university and you apply, and this happens a lot at the level of undergraduate, and you apply for jobs, and then nobody looks at your CV or your application, people will tell you, you need someone in the inside to pull you in. You need wasta, okay? And wasta is a social relations that manifest in a corrupt system where young people are not only young people, but all people are not provided with equal opportunities to compete in a system equally. Yes, it happened. I'm sure it happened to others as well. There's a concept called social capital that some people have formulated similarly to wasta, meaning they've identified social, or they've defined social capital as this concept of it's not what you know, it's who you know. Okay, so somebody who has an undergraduate degree might get a job in a bank and start to make good income because they have wasta or they have good connections through their family. And usually people who have wasta are people who have more wealth and more resources in any society, although in Lebanon it's more complex because there are people who don't have resources or wealth who rely on wasta because of political affiliation as well. But then they get different types of wasta rather than the wasta that gets you into like a managerial position in a bank. Okay, this is the same with gender and class. Basically, the intersection between gender and class is a qualitatively different experience than gender alone or class alone. So here, in the article, in the article by Hankivsky, I got this quote because I actually think it captures a lot of the things that we have talked about since the beginning of the semester. The importance of, why is this here? Okay. The importance of always considering context, and the importance of living with complexity, and in fact embracing complexity and appreciating it and not simplifying, because by simplifying then you dilute the meaning and you waste an opportunity to understand a social phenomenon or a public health phenomenon clearly. Can you please re-explain this concept of mutually constitutiveness? It was glitching when you explained the diagram. Okay, let me go back then. So the idea here is that people who experience, whether they experience their gender identity or they experience gender and patriarchy as a system of oppression, that's one level of experience. Then there are other people who may experience their identity in a racialized manner and may be discriminated against because of their racial identity. Okay, that's another level of experience. If there's, I mean, and this is what came out of the TED Talk with Kimberly Crenshaw, if a Black woman is also racialized, so she is a woman and she is Black in the context of the US, or she is a woman and she is a migrant worker from Ethiopia in the context of Lebanon. We're talking about gender and class here, gender and race. Okay, now the way this person experiences gender and race is mutually constitutive. It's not gender alone or race alone. It's a qualitatively different experience because this person is both a woman and is racialized as someone with dark or Black skin. Okay. The same thing here when we're talking about women who work in Lebanon as migrant workers. It's the experience they have is, or the discrimination they experience is because of patriarchy and because they are women, but also because they are domestic workers, and also in most cases because they have dark skin. Okay, so let's say even the experiences of sexual harassment, or the experiences of being respected or not respected in public spaces. It's not only because being a woman, and it's not only because of being a domestic worker or a working class person. It's heightened. It's a qualitatively different experience. So even if we think about sexual harassment, as a Lebanese woman would experience, of course, young Lebanese women experience sexual harassment. And a lot of our undergraduate students complain about this. But a domestic worker would experience sexual harassment differently. It's more, I mean, it's different qualitatively, and I would argue that it is more violent and scarier because of the fact that she is a foreigner, because of the fact that she has dark skin, and because of the fact that she is a domestic worker. Okay. So here, the promise of an intersectionality analysis is that it advances a new order of complexity. It makes us think more in a more complex way. If we want to understand how two different identities or two different systems of oppression interact with each other, intersect with each other in specific context, okay? Now, the example that is given by Kimberly Crenshaw is about a Black woman who's applying to work in a factory. This may not apply for us in Lebanon. I'm not sure how many women who have dark skin apply to work in factories. In fact, this is the case in a place like Jordan or Egypt, where they have garment factories, and women immigrants, particularly women from Sri Lanka, from Nepal, from Bangladesh, apply to work in these factories. So there is that specific context that basically influences the unique experiences of these women. both as women and as immigrant and as racialized individuals. So we didn't talk about health. Although we think about health as broadly conceived or conceptualized. But let me give you an example of basically the complexity and the importance of context. What do you think are the risk factors of HIV? Let's think about social risk factors and not the biological, the exchange of fluids and socioeconomic status, yes. Poverty, gender, homosexuality, okay.
Patriarchal societies.
Patriarchy, premarital sex, okay. So I want to problematize homosexuality and premarital sex because homosexuality in and of itself is not a risk factor. It's unprotected sex. It's also anal sex that is biologically more risky, okay? So unprotected sex. Premarital sex also, unprotected sex is also the risk factor. Yes, but you can say, but from a cultural point of view, that's basically how people conceive of risk factors. Okay, access to resources, homelessness. Okay, yes, absolutely. And access to resources, homelessness, patriarchy, dark skin, is it the dark skin or other things that the dark skin represents? Drug use, the use of needles, racism. Okay, that's great, that's great. One thing that is enmeshed or related to all of these factors that you have shown, that you have mentioned, is actually number of sexual partners, right? So early on in the HIV epidemic, basically they found that people who have more than 3 sex partners in the last month are at higher risk of HIV. But who does this relate to? Okay, the graphs that I'm going to show you are simulations, but they're actually based on research that is done, that I've read in my life. So the risk of HIV infection by number of sex partners, if we're talking about homosexual or not necessarily homosexual, not necessarily people who identify as homosexual, but men who have sex with men, in a place like San Francisco, which is the capital of gay culture, for example, you can say, one of the cities around the world that is considered to be places where people who want to experience gay culture go to. Okay, so early on in the HIV epidemic, people found out that the risk of HIV infection increases as the number of sex partners increases. So let's go then and move to Haiti. Does this apply to women who live in rural Haiti? Does it apply to women who are married? And do women who are married and who have only one sex partner then protected, then have a low risk of HIV? As you know, there are these theories that HIV started in Haiti and then it had to do with other things and went to Africa and then came back to the US and then spread around the world. Okay, in fact, I'm sure some of you have been introduced to someone whose name is Paul Farmer, who studied HIV in Haiti and in different parts of the world. He and his colleagues did some research in Haiti, and they found out that women who have one sex partner, who are married, who have one sex partner, but this sex partner, who is a husband, works in the city, has a city job, whether it's a mechanic or a driver or any other, have a high risk of HIV infection, even though they have one sex partner and it is their husband. On the other hand, woman whose sex partner is a farmer living in the rural areas have a low risk of HIV. So the risk here in Haiti is not about the number of sex partners for rural women. It's about what the occupation of that sex partner or the husband is. That is where the risk comes from. Okay, so this is an example of intersectionality. It's an example of how gender plays out with socioeconomic status in different contexts. In the context of San Francisco, a wealthy city in the US, versus in the context of rural Haiti. Haiti is one of the poorest countries around the world. So this is one example of intersectionality. I just want to highlight here that intersectionality is actually one of feminism's contributions to social theory. So intersectionality has moved feminist theory forward, and feminist theory has informed social theory, the way we conceptualize of society and we study society theoretically. Sarah?
Yes, doctor, I just want to add something to an example about HIV.
Yes.
I'm gonna give an example that's not like really research based, but we see it a lot, and especially in our culture, where men, it's not to accuse men, of course, but where men are experience a lot of heterogamy, whereas women are shamed if she does so. And most of the time, married women are not. It's not acceptable for married women to do protected sex and to tell her husband, "Oh no, you should wear a condom" or something. She's very much shamed about it, and so this is gives an increased risk of contracting HIV and other STDs as well, and it causes cervical cancer a lot here for women.
Right, so that's the example, thank you for adding this. That's an example of HIV in Haiti that, I mean, it's not about the person being a mechanic in the city. It's about the exposure, the idea that, maybe I should have said this, it's the idea that a woman in rural Haiti who is married to a man who who travels to the city and works in the city may be engaging in extramarital relations, may be engaging in sex tourism, for example, which is very big in Haiti because men from New York, for example, travel to Haiti to have homosexual, to basically engage in sex for pay, homosexual or heterosexual as well. Okay, so that's the risk, yeah. Thank you, yes. On the other hand, when the husband is a farmer, then the mobility is less and the possibility of engaging in extramarital relations, sexual relations is much lower. And that's why the woman's risk of HIV is lower. Okay, one thing I want to emphasize, and it's related to the idea of mutually constitutive, is the fact that intersectionality says that, you know, the way we think about how gender and race, or gender and social class, or gender and disability operate in determining people's well-being, people's identity, people's well-being, people's health, is not only additive, it's intersectional, meaning, I mean, the other term to use is that it's multiplicative. Okay, so it's not that you add one form of oppression and one form of oppression and you get the total of these. It's about an experience that is intersectional and interlocking, that differs and is not only additive. It might in fact be multiplicative. It might, you know, this intersection might make gender oppression much worse and racial oppression much worse than gender oppression alone and racial oppression alone. Okay. These are some of the examples that are presented in the Hankivsky article. She talks about HIV, violence, and cardiovascular disease. Does anybody remember what she says about this, other than HIV, but violence and CVD? I can remind you. One of the things that she presented in her article, an argument actually, is that we need to move beyond just thinking about sex and gender as the center of intersectionality analysis or an intersectional analysis. Her argument is that, and frankly, I don't agree with it, but I have to be open-minded and read more about it. Her argument is that traditionally, intersectional analysis has been presented as gender in its relationship to all other social identities or all other systems, structural systems that people live in. That it's about the relationship between sex, gender, and age, sex, gender, and race, sex, gender, and immigrant status, for example. What Hankiewski argues is that we need to decenter sex and gender in any true intersectional analysis. We need to be think even more in a more complex way, so that it's not always about gender and its relationship to other things. It can be about race, ethnicity, and ability. Race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation. Race, ethnicity, and immigrant status, or SES. And the examples that she presented, actually, when she talked about violence and cardiovascular disease, the evidence that she presented from research that's been done is basically, she presented it to make an argument that when it comes to cardiovascular disease, socioeconomic status is more important than gender. When it comes to violence or experiences of violence, that immigrant status or living in poverty is more important in terms of determining people's experiences with violence. Okay. Okay, I'm not sure I agree with this, because I think that even with violence, gender is important, but it's not gender meaning woman. I mean, if you think about the police violence in the United States, for example, it's very gendered because it's about Black men. Okay, of course it touches for sure Black women, but police violence primarily is directed against Black men in the US. So gender is part of it, but we need to also think of gender as feminine, masculine, men, woman. Not only, gender is not only women or female sex. Well, okay, it's race. So Black, again, is racialized in the US, but it's also gendered, because this violence that is inflicted against Black men is also about the fear of Black men, or the stereotyping of Black men as, you know, a threat, and a drug users, and a threat, and basically on the margins of the law. Yeah. They see Black males, of course, yes. So that's the argument, is that it's gendered, but it's about men in this context. Cardiovascular disease as well is very much gendered. I'm not sure I agree with, I mean, I'm sure she's presenting results from studies, but cardiovascular disease is a gendered phenomenon or an outcome in terms of how we conceptualize it, even though the majority of women die of cardiovascular disease, and we tend to think of cardiovascular disease as a men's health outcome. But there are gender and social class differences in cardiovascular disease. And the idea here, we're talking about high income countries, but I also think it applies to Lebanon, it applies to other countries. I mean, Egypt, India, and some countries in Latin America where cardiovascular disease is really an outcome of poverty. In high-income countries, but also in countries that have undergone the epidemiologic transition, people who live in poverty or people who have lower socioeconomic status experience cardiovascular disease or die of cardiovascular disease at a higher rate. Yes, the research on cardiovascular disease focuses on men. I mean, when I started working at in the Faculty of Health Sciences, my colleagues were making statements that men die of cardiovascular disease, women die of breast cancer. And it's absolutely, the evidence is absolutely doesn't show this. The majority of women in Lebanon die of cardiovascular disease. Now, there are problems with recording cause of death, but nonetheless, cardiovascular disease is the main cause of death in middle income and high income countries around the world. This is an example. It's also a simulation, but it's based on some of the work I did on how much money people make based on their level of education. Okay, so here, this kind of like supports the argument by Hankivsky where, you know, maybe it's not only about women, it's also about refugee status. So these are refugees in Lebanon. These are, you know, it's a simulation really, but that's what we found in one of the articles and one of the studies that we did. Yeah. Melody's point, yeah. Because women live longer, so they develop cardiovascular disease in old age, yes. And it is misdiagnosed a lot. Sometimes women go to the emergency room with symptoms of a heart attack, and it's misdiagnosed because of stereotypes and perceptions. I think I'm not going to be able to go over the example on FGM, but I want to, then I will start with it next week because it's also a very important example of intersectionality here. But so here, this is data that we looked at comparing Palestinian refugees and Lebanese citizens. This is an old paper. And basically what this paper showed is that it's not only about education, level of education. It's not, it's not a revelation. I think people know about this. It's also about refugee status. It's not only about gender, it's also about refugee status. So here you would expect that as people's level of education increases, their income should increase. And thankfully you see that income increases. But if you compare Lebanese men to Lebanese women, although the wages of Lebanese women increase with their level of education, they always remain lower than Lebanese men. Okay, this trend is also in the US. This trend is also in other parts of the world. There is a gender, a patriarchal, and here we're controlling for education only. We're not controlling for where people, yeah, I'm not sure, but yes, there is quite a gap between men's wages and women's wages by level of education. Then if you look at refugees, a similar trend, refugee men make more wages compared to refugee women, but the wages or the income of refugees is always lower than citizens, irrespective of their level of education. Okay, and in fact, the lower education the refugee and the citizen have, the smaller the gap. And this is one of the things why, there's this idea that why should refugees get an education if their jobs and their incomes are not going to improve? There is this argument out there. Well, they will improve, but of course their income will always be lower than citizens. Okay. Even if they occupy the same positions, women are paid less than men. Yes, and actually, even some analyses that were done on wages, on salaries at AUB showed that women professors make lower salaries. And then there was this argument, well, because men are in engineering and business and women are in nursing and public health and sociology. Yeah, but I think even further analysis would show that even women in public health make lower wages than lower, not wages, but lower salaries, annual salaries. Yeah, okay. What do we have next? These are questions, we're on like, not the overtime, I think, yeah, we are 3 minutes over time maybe, or more. These are questions that I would like you to contemplate and think about, okay, for this course, but also in your life in the future, if you become a researcher. Let me stop here, and this is where I'll start next week, as to whether we should study intersectionality or examine intersectionality through quantitative or qualitative research methods. And those of you who are in HPCH will automatically say qualitative, but not always. You can use both. You can use mixed methods. Okay, and then I want us to talk about this maybe uncomfortable topic on female genital mutilation, cutting, circumcision, clitoridectomy. Okay, so think about what it is, and not only what it is medically, not medically, but what the procedure is, but what does it mean? And since you have the slides on your on Moodle, you might want to look at some of this data that I showed from 2 important reports, the Egypt Demographic Health Survey of 2015, where in Egypt, 87% of the women between 15 and 49 years of age have undergone FGM. But to some of you, the surprise might be that in Iraq, FGC is also an issue, but its overall prevalence is much lower than Egypt. However, there are some regions in Iraq, and they are primarily Kurdish regions, where FGM is 50% of the women. So, and then I show this graph, which is a pure intersectional analysis related to FGM. So let's talk about this next week. But for now, just think about this question. What is FGM? Okay, you can Google and know what it is, but what does it mean exactly? What does it mean for FGM to take place? Okay. Any questions before we close?
Dr. Sri, I have a question about the assignment. Dr. Jana is talking.
Sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, I have a question about my topic. Maybe we can, after everyone leaves, I can just talk to you for like a few minutes.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
I also have a question.
Yes. About your topic?
Yeah. The assignment.
Okay. Anybody has a question about something that we talked about today? Okay. So next week we'll start with this, and then we'll basically break into groups, and then we'll talk about the 2 articles on moral panic, ethics and values. Okay. So who's going to stay? Jana and who?
Dana, I think.
Dana. Okay, let's start with Jana. So everyone else, do you think your questions will be relevant to others? If not,
I don't think mine is, no.
Okay.
I'm fine. I just want to أنا إذا بدك جانا إذا I can start and it's just
So everyone
Sure.
can leave if you have other things to do. I actually have 9 minutes. Yeah. So let's start with Jana and then Dana,
Okay.
Dana and then Jana.
Okay, doctor. So hi.
I'm gonna
Okay,
stop
so
recording. Sorry. One
okay.
second. Let me stop recording. Stop recording.